All right, welcome everyone. This is ModX New Zealand. This is a webinar, and we want to welcome all those attendees who have come on today. We're going to have this screen on, so you're not going to see big heads, but we do have some faces there on the side. Ivan, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce the webinar and our guests.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks, Ryan. I'm Ivan Rupnik, a partner in crime with this gentleman on the other screen, Ryan Smith, architect, professor at Northeastern University, and researcher and consultant in the offsite modular space. And looking forward to learning more about New Zealand, which I haven't yet visited.
No, we would love to go to New Zealand with the group from ModX. We hope to do that in the future. I'm Ryan Smith, as Ivan said. We run ModX together, which is a research, education, and consultancy. And I am also a professor of architecture and direct a School of Design and Construction at Washington State University, go Cougs. And since COVID, we have not been taking people on our education journeys like this one in the image, and instead have transitioned online. If you are interested, you can go to modx.network and view some of our network voices. We have our webinars posted there. This one will be posted as well that you're participating in today, and some video casts of experts. So go check it out, and you can consume that content at no charge. Our goal as ModX is to exchange knowledge and try to disseminate information as freely and as rapidly as possible so that innovation can dissipate. Some things we have coming up before we get started on this webinar, and that is Ivan and I will be speaking tomorrow at World of Modular, a virtual session on business and product platforms. And welcome you to join. You can register for World of Modular online. ModX Education in the middle there. This is a new offering if you are located or do business in the Pacific Northwest. This is a regional ecosystem capability workshop series. And you can go on our website and register for that if you so wish. It's over a number of sessions. And then on the end there, manufacturing thinking, we're giving a talk on that at the AEI virtual conference in early April as well, on appropriate levels of automation in the factory. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Guy Marriage and Pamela Bell. They will introduce themselves, I think, a little more thoroughly, but I would just say that it's been a pleasure to work with them in preparation for this webinar. Guy is an architect at First Light Studio. He's also on PrefabNZ board member. That's the trade association for prefabrication in New Zealand that they will talk about today. He's also author of a High Rise book that you can find on Amazon, and he'll talk a little bit about that. Pamela Bell, Ivan and I have known for a number of years. And she was the original founder of PrefabNZ, and also was the chief executive prior to handing over the reins. And some things you'll learn about Pam is she's a competitive skier, or was, right? Downhill skier. And she'll talk a little bit about that, which I thought was fascinating. The guy is involved with Victoria University of Wellington. And we just want to say thank you for taking the time today. And what we're going to do today is they will present for a significant portion of the time. And then you can type your questions as an audience in the Q&A button. It's at the bottom there. And we'll go through the presentation first. Ivan will keep track of the questions and then help moderate at the end. If you would, Ivan, ask those questions of our guests. You attendees, participants, you're unable to unmute like in a normal Zoom meeting. In a webinar format, the only way to communicate is in that chat box or in the Q&A. So just FYI. With that, I want to welcome Pamela Bell and Guy Marriage, and turn the time over to them for an introduction and their presentation. I will stop sharing here. Go right ahead.
Cool, thanks you guys. Just 1 second while we do the requisite button pushing at our end. Okay, hopefully you can see our screen. All good? Cool. I'm just going to minimize these. All right. Welcome to the State of Play for Prefabrication in New Zealand. With you over policies, projects, processes, and people. Kia ora koutou.
Which is Maori for hi everyone.
So today we're going to give you a quick overview about ourselves, about prefabrication in New Zealand, where it's come from, where it's at today, the growing awareness that we're developing alongside the Industry Association, PrefabNZ, some of the current market forces, what's shaping what we call our wicked housing problem, and some of the more exciting challenges or opportunities for the role that government can play as client, government legislation can play, the manufacturing industry, which is bringing research and development to the party, and what's happening within academia and research that is innovative and interesting, hopefully to you all.
It's a little bit of me. My real job is I'm a lecturer, what you would call a professor, but you have to be a lot older to be a professor here. So, but lecturer, I'm also an architect with a practice here called First Light Studio, and I'm on the board of PrefabNZ. You'll see on the left, there's a book that I wrote last year, which is fantastic. It really is. I've been told by all my students, it's really good. It's aimed at third-year architecture students in terms of building tall. And I'm working on the second book on that, which is about apartment design, which is really interesting, writing about apartment design in the middle of a pandemic. So that's me.
Cool, and this is me. As Ryan said, I did a bit of time on the snow, so I had a bit of a soft spot for the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia in particular up here in Canada. So I studied architecture. After I was done with snowboarding, which took me through World Cup and the Olympics, I managed to set myself in the architecture industry. There I became curious about prefabrication and did a Master of Architecture, which culminated in a book, an exhibition, and the Industry Association, PrefabNZ, which I ran for a decade. And then I have been consulting for almost 2 years now under my own name, Pamela Bell.nz is the website, and recently became an adjunct professor here at Victoria University of Wellington. And Guy and myself have just run a prototype online course called Design Thinking Business, which is about what happens at that intersection between business and architecture and design, which is really kind of a COVID response to what's going to happen to our young graduates as they come out of architecture and design school. How can we equip them with more design thinking-based skills that they can take into government and corporate context? So I've known Guy when he was my tutor. We both worked together as architects at Studio Pacific. And we PrefabNZ, and now more recently through Victoria University. So this is really the Pam and Guy show.
And just in case any of you are unaware, people used to think that New Zealand was part of Australia. We're not. As you know us more, we're the country of Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth, full of Kiwis. Well, not full of Kiwis. There's a couple of Kiwis still around. And we call ourselves Kiwis, not after the fruit, but after the bird. Lots of jokes about Kiwis being unable to fly, but we're all grounded at the moment.
And it really is as beautiful as what you see on The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So as soon as those borders open up, we'd welcome you all to visit. So just a little bit about our prefab story. Some of you might know that lovely book, Home Delivery, and the exhibition that was in New York of the same name some time ago that pinpointed the starting point with the Industrial Revolution. Well, just because we like to be a bit different down in this part of the world, we have pinpointed the start of prefabrication with the bundling of bulrush on the side of a swamp or a wetland into wall panels. And this is what the indigenous Maori people did pre-1800s. Of course, when the white folks arrived, they brought with them kit set housing. And so the image in the top right is the Manning Portable Cottage from the UK. And on the bottom right there, you've got a kit set timber frame building that came from Australia to New Zealand and is known as our treaty house, or a document that was signed between the Indigenous and the colonial people. So that was in the 1830s. Since then, there's been a number of influences from offshore. This was a factory that was set up to create housing for hydro skiing workers. New Zealand has got a great use of renewable electricity, mainly power generated, a little bit of wind, but we created these small towns to house the workers that created those large infrastructure projects. So back in the 1960s, this factory was set up by a Dutch gentleman, the De Geest family, and it looks like they're literally pumping these houses out on a conveyor belt, but of course they're panelized with some volumetric elements inside them and then fully transportable to site. In the 1970s, in the height of modernism in architecture and design, there was an influence from a group called Industrialized Building Systems. It was a panelized volumetric method, had a very low roof, which was not very easy for regular customers to get accustomed to, because of course the vernacular is to have a higher pitch roof. There were big plans to have factories across New Zealand and Australia, and the government was even backing this. But the understanding is, from speaking to a number of these gentlemen before they kind of passed away, is that the unions and the builders and carpenters in particular got them and got that stopped. There was risk that to lose jobs. So what has endured though is in New Zealand is a timber-based traditional building system, and Guy will talk more about that in a minute. And another import from the Netherlands is this interlocking timber system, which goes under a number of brand names, including Lockwood. So this is one which today has got insulation inside it, and there's an architecture design series to help promote that system of building. And then on the right there, you can see the classic pre-nailed frame and pre-nailed roof truss factory. And this is literally how 95% of our housing is built today. Some of our houses get moved in one piece, and because New Zealand has got such a lovely long coastline with a lot of remote sites, and we have a lot of buildings on the back of trucks since about the 1960s, from memory. So where are things at today?
So today, this picture that you see before you now comes from Pam's work at PrefabNZ. So this is the way that we look at prefab in New Zealand. So things are either components that come to site, like we saw in the last picture, or fully built up panels, or volumes, also known as pods, and then hybrid projects, which are a mixture of pods and panels, and then sometimes complete buildings that come to site. So a whole range of mixtures. So we look at the first one, components. So this is by some of our local hero architects, strong group. And so this building was essentially built from prefabricated components. So all the parts came to site and were assembled on site. The second thing where we're looking at panels. So this is one of our new factories that can do this. We've only got a few of these factories. Is the big company down in the South Island. And so they're looking particularly at wall panels and floor panels that come to site. Then we've got volumetric. And so this is a really interesting one. This was done maybe about 10 years ago now. And so you can just see in the middle of the picture, there's a volume being lifted up. So this was a student housing project. So the volumes were made about 100 kilometers away, were shipped up here and lifted into the building as they were building the buildings. Every 3 floors, they had a floor of concrete, and these completely timber pods were lifted into place, already pre-finished with a carpet down and a bed in place. This is an example very dear to my heart. This is sort of a hybrid project, which we'll talk about more later, but this is a project we did at Victoria University for the Solar Decathlon project, which many of you will be aware of. And so this one won 3rd prize in the Solar Decathlon, so we're pretty happy about that. But it went as a series of 5 completely built pod series of panels that were shipped in a container. And then finally, complete buildings. So here's one from Keith Hay Homes, which is one of our older, more established prefabricated building manufacturers. And so you can see this sort of aesthetic goes down really well in New Zealand. It'll be interesting to see how you feel over there, but it probably it feels a lot smaller perhaps than you might be used to in terms of housing. These are some of the people or the companies that are in the business today. So the two at the top, Concision in the South Island and Clevercore, which is part of Fletcher's in the North Island. And Fletcher's are New Zealand's biggest residential builder. And Clevercore are also hoping to open up a Clever Floor, Clever Pod, and Clever Wall, which sounds really interesting to me as an architect, whether we'll be able to actually order parts from their factories. And then there's a raft of smaller easy key things, which are filling that sort of middle space.
Cool. So that's where we're at today. And what's helped really with the awareness in the last decade has been the formation of an industry association, PrefabNZ. So you can find prefabnz.com and a whole raft of information is there, very much along the lines of what Ryan and Ivan talked about in the spirit of collaboration and sharing. So the membership of PrefabNZ is a mixture of consultants, architects, engineers, builders and manufacturers and anyone else who touches the design and construction journey and who's interested in prefabrication. So here's a very short, less than 2-minute video that shows one of the kind of main events that PrefabNZ runs, which is called the CoLab.
Prefabrication and modular construction help to the capacity constraints that our sector in construction is facing.
We're talking about lots of automation. We're talking about artificial intelligence, edge devices, cloud computers, thinking about how we can transform how we build in New Zealand.
We are able to deliver building faster, safer, at high quality, and friendlier to the environment.
3D printing, we want to get out little plastic objects into real buildings, and that's probably going to happen. If you want to be part of this, work with us. We're losing more people every year through retirement than we are gaining through new entrants coming into our industry. And we said, let's just talk about digital fabrication, because some of this is real and we can exploit it today. Yeah, if you don't prefab, you're a moron. And I think, again, for the work that you do in your industry, in your firms, in your workplaces, work that PrefabNZ does on this incredibly important task. Thank you.
So that was a good little snapshot of what happens at our events, a bit of wine drinking, lots of talking, a bit of agitation. So that's a good example also of the proximity we are in New Zealand to our ministers. We had 2 ministers at that event, which was really useful, and also marked a point where prefabrication became part of the ministerial lexicon, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Look, this is just a snapshot what you can do with an industry association in 10 years. For us, it was a journey of putting out provocative ideas, plans, value cases, identifying issues. I'm sure you're with mainly around permitting, or what we call consenting in New Zealand, access to finance, and unlocking some of the misperceptions around the use of words around prefabrication, modular, offsite, etc. We also experienced an earthquake during the time PrefabNZ was established and responded by setting up a show home village. And then we later wrote a book about that, and we did a number of design competitions that we'll touch on as well. And when the government looked really closely at importing prefabricated homes from offshore, we set out and did a capacity and capability report that showed just how much the local industry could develop. So, Guy, over to you.
Okay, so just going to have a few words then about the market forces in New Zealand. And I guess the way that we have always traditionally built in New Zealand is this, and possibly you're aware of this as well, but this is what we really like to do in New Zealand. We're one man, one you, and that equals one house. And that's pretty much how everything has been built up to now. And Pam and I are really keen to change that because we think it's rather inefficient. But we've had a number of events, and Pam mentioned that there was and earthquake. There's actually been, I think it's like 6,000 earthquakes since that big earthquake. It caused a huge amount of damage. So it killed 185 people. Over 10,000 buildings were demolished, and another 100,000 buildings were severely damaged. The ground basically liquefied. Everything that was brick fell down, and everything that was stone fell down, and everything that was timber more or less stayed together. You can see in that bottom picture, that building, lovely old building, but the roof, which is timber, is still hanging together, even though the floors below have completely collapsed away. All the brick is gone. So we've really been, it's pushing the whole country to change the way that it thinks about building. We've also had other things such as our house price in New Zealand ridiculously high. So here we are in the group of countries such as Switzerland and Luxembourg, where their per capita income is really high, and little old New Zealand, where our per capita income is quite a lot lower, we're still got an extremely high house price. So we like to think that we're up there with the wealthiest country, but in reality we're not. We've also had, as a result of that, probably a massive increase in both in population and in property prices as a result. We've got Air New Zealand, our wonderful airline, is obviously grounded, flying internationally at the moment, flying nationally around the country. But we've had a lot of people returning home. So a lot of people caught up in COVID overseas have come running back to New Zealand, which is great. And so we're running out of houses because we don't have enough room for everybody.
We should probably say that we're not actually socially distanced because we're not under an alert level that requires us to do that.
Yeah,
so
no mask.
Many of you may know that and not so much eliminate but contain that risk. So I'm sorry to say, but it's a little bit life as usual here compared to the rest of the world.
Life as usual, but no holidays overseas. Hey, one of the big issues that we had was the thing that was called the leaky building crisis. And I believe in Canada, there was a leaky condo crisis in the 90s. And so New Zealand's been copying everything from overseas. So we even copied your crisis. And we made all the same mistakes that you guys had made as well, which is really disappointing. So it's sort of a culmination of all these events that happened at once. From 1991, we freed up the Building Act. We changed the use of materials so you could have untreated timber. We changed the way that buildings looked, so a lot of Mediterranean-style buildings in a very wet climate like Washington, with lots of moisture in the air, really poor detailing, all these sorts of things added up. And so we've had a lot of buildings that have been rotting, considering that it's 47 billion just rework to rotting buildings at the moment.
So it's been a really complex, I guess, market overview, if you like. A couple of the other things we wanted to mention is New Zealand has an unenviable record of being at the top of the homelessness chart. You can see there we're right at the top of the OECD countries, and one of the fastest growing groups of homelessness is women over 50. So it's not a great statistic, and one that we are working on reducing. We have a public housing register, which is where people register to go on the waiting list for state housing. And as you can see from this graph, that list or that register has pretty much quadrupled in the last 3 or 4 years. And of course, this is just entities or households registering, not even individual people. So the reality is it's a lot more people than is even reflected in that graph. Another thing is we are in a growing, exponentially busy part of our industry. It's what's called a wall of work, and the shape of those permits or consents is changing. The yellow part of this graph shows the apartments, the townhouses, the multi-houses, I think what you call in North America multi-family. We call it medium density housing, or MDH. And this is a part of the market that is growing. It's very confrontational for our culture because you would have seen from a lot of those images, people prefer to live in a single family dwelling on what is typically coined a quarter-acre section. Of course, by now you know that that's completely unaffordable and not obtainable anymore. So the dialogue around housing is now much more about townhouses and medium density, which lends itself really well to prefabrication. So the question you might have, what's with all the timber?
We had this as the question. I guess, you know, the thing about New Zealand is that it's a long, skinny country, and it's got a wide and very much varied geography. But it's been heavily forested. It's only been relatively recent. It's one of the more recently discovered countries in the world, about 1,000 years ago when the Maori discovered it, and another 200 years ago when the white people sort of got here. But so there's a lot of trees and a lot of really beautiful trees. You can see there, this particular tree, we know all our trees by name. This is Tane Mahuta, who is the god of the forest. But it's a very seismically active country. It's on the edge of the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate. So there's this huge amount of shaking that goes on. We had a batch of earthquakes last week. I think we've had about 50 earthquakes since last Friday, which sort of keeps us awake at times. But there's been no tradition of building in stone because of that shaky nature and because our stone isn't really that old. We're really building in timber. We build in timber all the time. And so this is what you see all the time on the roads and the rail. Here is a lot of logging trucks taking these logs to port and just exporting. Most of our logs just go straight out as logs. What we're really keen on is to produce these logs into buildable products and then either use them ourselves or export them once they've been made into something more useful. So that's what we're really pushing here. But we've already chopped down most of the native forests. So we're not allowed to chop native forests anymore, which is really good. It's where all the native birds live. But we've got our forested areas now are about 95% radiata pine. And in New Zealand, for some reason, it grows very straight and very fast. You can see there those skinny trees really powering up. So we've got very, very good skinny logs that we use. We're also going to be planting twice as many as we are at the moment. Part of that to offset our carbon balance, because we've also got a lot of cows and sheep that burp and fart quite a lot, and that emit lots of CO2. And so part of our strategy for absorbing that CO2 is in other parts of the country to have lots of forests. So all of our farmers that have just been sheep farming or beef farming so far, they're probably also going to be tree farming as well. We've got because we're always building our buildings out of timber, as you can see here, they're pretty lightweight. And this is not, we showed that earlier picture of it being transported, but they can even pick them up and move them around. And we're really used to being able to alter our buildings in New Zealand, very much a DIY culture of do it yourself and pick up the hammer and build things, which is both great and also leads to a lot of problems, to be honest. So we're really keen that the future, a lot more buildings will be prefabricated so we can get the higher quality level.
Oh, so one of the areas of challenge opportunity is in government's role in this process or journey around prefabrication. And I just wanted to point out this great quote that came from the Offsite for Construction report that the CSIRO, which is a research body in Australia, put out along with construction skills in Queensland. So they point out that any kind of major change requires a really significant external force, that you need to have a number of enablers, such as the early adopters, the investment in innovation. You need to have the safe spaces for R&D, and of course, you need the appropriate levels of regulatory oversight. So the really strong external force is what I think Mark Farmer from Cast Consultancy in the UK, and you might have spotted him in that collab video, he talks about the overarching need for a demand-led stimulus from government, which is essentially government as client. So in New Zealand, we have had an example of government as client, and that scheme was called Kiwi Build. It's put in a couple of years ago, and the goal was to deliver 100,000 houses over 10 years. Of course, we're aware of the great success Sweden's had with 1 million homes over 10 years in the mid-60s to mid-70s. We weren't able to replicate that due to a number of reasons, including the fact that the government's Kiwi Build scheme didn't get the buy-in from the public, they didn't get the buy-in from the media, and as a consequence, they didn't get the buy-in from the construction industry. They also weren't able to place large enough capacity and capability orders that would enable manufacturers to invest in upskilling, invest in manufacture, and invest in their pipeline of production. So the Kiwi Build scheme has become a much smaller, resized scheme, I think is the appropriate word. And so that is now existing inside our social housing agency, Kāinga Ora Homes and Communities. Now, Kāinga Ora, which used to be called Housing NZ, has been doing really interesting projects. It seems to ring fence something off in a corner when you're government, it's much easier to get something new happening. So that's what they've been doing, piloting projects and then taking those lessons learned, and now they're doing the planning around putting it into business as usual. So they've done a 3-story apartment walk up with cross-laminated stairs and floors and walls, as you can see from these images. I've been doing some work here with Kaingora on this building momentum strategy, which is about building better because the social housing agency is now being tasked with almost double the amount of houses it has to produce every year. So you would remember that social housing need graph. So now we're having to deliver more and more and more every year. So of course they're looking for better ways to do that. It's around better partnering, better innovation, quality design, better delivery, and better sustainability. So if you can remember the axiom of more for more people for less money, yes, it's trying to do that. So one of the really interesting pilots that they are pushing ahead with now that we're right on the edge of is cross-laminated floors and internal walls, an exterior composite or cassette cladding wall panel system, and infill pod bathrooms. So to me, that's the ultimate hybrid. So really watching that space with interest.
So recently, the government has been looking at, I guess, updating the legislation that we have. So our legislation is probably a little bit out of date for this. So there's a new bill that's going through government at the moment. It's got a really snappy title, which is the Building (brackets Building Products and Methods, Modular Components and Other Matters) in brackets Amendment Bill. So you know, even the bill is going to be really overly complicated. It's got interesting things where they're talking about legislating building products and building methods, which to my mind is a little bit simplistic in that you could argue that a nail is a building product and a building method is to hit it with a hammer. How much legislation you need on that? Obviously, they're looking at larger things than that, but they're getting quite involved in trying to attribute where responsibility lies, who makes who's accountable for the building at what stage. And so part of this bill, I can't even say the name, is that they're looking to have a specialist framework for what they call MMC, Modern Methods of Construction. And to do that, they're going to set up a system of modular component manufacturers, MCM. So you're going to have to certify that with the MCMC, and that will go through an MCMCB, so a board looking at the MCMC. None of this fills me with great confidence. I'm sure there are lots of fantastic people in government. I'm not sure they have enough experience in that. And so that's part of what PrefabNZ is going to be doing as a lobby group is, and the most knowledgeable lobby group in the industry is to really try and affect the government to try and make this go through and become as simple as possible. So that's what we're hoping that we've got a few more months before it actually becomes law. And so we're really hoping we'll be able to make it a little bit simpler and a little bit more streamlined. At the moment, it's going to be affecting about 2 companies in the country, the 2 big companies, and the smaller companies are probably just going to say, I don't want any part of that.
So behind every great acronym is a really simple idea, and the simple idea being about certifying the factory rather than each individual product. Fingers crossed. So a quick snapshot about our industry, and then our last section is around academia and industry. Or academia research rather. So where we're at with our manufacturing at the moment, we've given you an overview of our timber, so foundation, if you like. We've been doing great timber engineering, world-renowned timber engineering for a number of years. So over 10 years ago, this project came together, and it's got large plywood kind of rocking walls with pre-tension steel inside them. The idea here to have a seismic resistant design, one where the building could be reused, because as we know from Christchurch, there was a huge amount of wastage in the demolishing of buildings and parts of buildings. So the idea now is to use timber with steel pre-tensioned to be able to have a reusable building after the fact. This is another one of those types of buildings. There's pre-stressed steel inside the columns. Post-stressed, sorry. Thank you, inside the columns and beams. And that system can be inside concrete or timber. Yeah, press lam, that's what it's called, isn't it?
Yeah.
A couple of extra.
Some really interesting.
Thanks for the post.
Really interesting products there.
Yeah, it's post in the posts. And the other thing here is body designs located in those ceiling panels. So it's pretty neat to see the digital technology that's used in that space too. This is a really neat building using a laminated near lumber. It's the Mount Pleasant Community Centre, and this has won both national and international recognition for the engineering. And of course, this is that lovely idea of structure as interior surface. So creating one job with one material. This is a great structure over a key tourist attraction, actually, the Waitomo Caves, and it's one of our better international visitors points to see after you've been to Hobbiton, of course. So very elegant PTFE structure with these interlocking I-beams that were laminated and brought to site.
It's currently empty because we've got no tourists. So, you know, come on over as soon as you get the chance, once you've had your vaccine.
Yeah, there you go. And New Zealand was the first country in the Southern Hemisphere to create a cross-laminated timber which was bought by and closed and moved to Australia, but that's a story for another day. So this is a really interesting firm of young architects who have got a making aspect to their studio as well as a design aspect. They went and bought their own CNC machine. So here's our last section.
So this comes out of work that I've been doing, and that's that company, we'll talk about them in a second. So this is the project that really set it all off for us here at the school. You've probably all heard of the sort of Decathlon in the US. This was the first time that a building from the Southern Hemisphere had got there. And so we took it very seriously. We designed this building, all designed by the students. And I was just sort of overseeing things. The building then went off to the States on the back of a boat. And so ours was, this is the most house in the history of the world. So it's been around the world. Not many houses have been around the world. Some have been halfway around. This one's been all the way around. And it's already, when you see it here, this is the fourth time it's been erected. So it was made so that it could be erected and taken apart and put back together again. And it's currently residing in Hawke's Bay, which is a lovely part of the world. So this was a really interesting project, which a lot of us got very interested in that. And following that, we set up a company called First Light, and after the house. And we also managed to win this competition, which was a PrefabNZ competition. And so First Light won this competition for a unipod, which is a combined bathroom and kitchen pod, where all of the technological stuff is in the wall, and then your bathroom or your kitchen can get bigger as required. So this has been really interesting, and we've got some really interesting, we've got some industry partners who are looking very seriously at this, which is great.
First Light, you're a director of.
Yes, yeah. These are some of my students. So you can see there the house at the top by Ben Sutherland. So that was his master's thesis. He was looking at using CLT, and I went away for a couple of weeks and he said, actually, I'm going to build a whole house for my master's, which he did. So that was New Zealand's first CLT house. Got Mitch Holden on the right, who's been looking at prefabricated panels. And so we've now employed him as well. And then the final one down the bottom, designing for deconstruction, Jed Finch did his master's with me looking at ways of avoiding waste. And he's since gone on to form his own company, X-Frame. And so X-Frame is the system that he developed in his master's, he's now been developing in his PhD. And he's building a number of these houses. So both in Australia and in New Zealand, really huge amount of waste reduction. And the reuse of the building. So these buildings are put together with this system that we've tested. There's no screws, there's no nails. It's put together a few bolts. But so the whole building can be taken apart and reused, and it's quite strong. So you see there being printed out or cut out on the CNC left, assembled from those pieces, and then buildings you see on the right. So there's a number of these that have been tested and implemented at the moment, which is really good. So Jed is everyone in this country is talking about a very clever young guy. A lot of pressure on his shoulders, but he's doing well.
And he's got a really cool TEDx talk if you want to Google that. We'll make sure those links are in the show notes along with any videos. There was another competition that we did during my time at PrefabNZ, which was about Snug, a home in my backyard, which is, I think, the accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, as it gets referred to in other parts of the world. So this is the idea of creating more affordable solutions close to home, particularly for young professionals who are unable to save a deposit for their own home. And we twice out of about 100 entries. And the idea was that a pattern book was created. So we weren't putting forward one idea, but in fact, many different ideas for people to reconsider how to repurpose their own backyards. And that lovely wee one up in the middle on the top was this cute one that won the People's Choice Award. We did an old-fashioned kind of street poster competition with a digital survey, and these folks won the People's Choice. And it was based, yeah, those good people from First Light Studio again, who keep popping up, based off the New Zealand jandal or flip-flop, which is our preferred footwear when we go to the beach. And we brought some of, well, all 12 winners to life through scale models with the help of Victoria University of Wellington student over a summer project, and had them on display at a number of conferences, including PrefabNZ's own conference, the CoLab, that was a couple of years ago. And it has turned into a company.
So we're formally called Flip, which is starting to roll these out around the country, which is really satisfying. But we're running out of time, so we're going to wrap it up, I think.
We are. And this is the way we wrap up. Hei tangata, hei tangata, hei tangata.
It's about the people, always the people. And so that's what sort of New Zealand's motto is. So there we are, listed down the bottom. You can contact us at any time. And I think we're going to open up for some questions now. So we're going to stop sharing.
Share and come back to you. Cool.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Guy, for your presentation and spending the time to go through history, sort of the market forces, and then into what's currently happening and even in academia. So thank you. And it's always nice to see what contextual factors give rise to certain types of prefabrication in certain parts of the world. And just really appreciate you taking the time to do this. There was a question generally, and then I'll have Ivan start in on the questions that was asked, I think, of the webinar in general, and that was, can we get these slides? We are recording this, so we will post-process and get to our MODEX website as well as YouTube. So stay tuned for that, and we will send that directly to you as you're registered for this webinar, and we have your information. So with that, I'm going to turn this to Ivan for some questions. I would also encourage you to please type in questions either in the chat or even in the Q&A. The Q&A is kind of a button at the bottom. It's unique to webinars. You could do either, and we can moderate that and help you get your questions answered. Ivan Rupnik, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Pam and Guy. I think just because I was talking about this, my graduate students right before, I'm going to start with a topic that's also near and dear to my heart. Maybe unpacking a little bit more about what went right and what went wrong with the Kiwi Build program, because I think it's something that we've been looking at across a number of contexts. Actually, we were looking at the McKinsey report recently, the sort of that launched 1,000 ships, and one of the first lines is, regulatory overhaul, and then there's a bunch of other things, but that was the first point that McKinsey made in terms of the change in production in construction productivity in general. But we don't really have a good playbook. There's a lot of public programs that mostly have gone wrong, and we can talk about some of the ones we've studied. Similar reasons, actually, some patterns, but maybe just digging in a little bit more about where Kiwi Build came from, and maybe why, what you guys feel are some of the limits, because it sounds like the fact that it existed at all is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Pam was working closely.
Yeah. I can talk about the genesis. The communication breakdown and failure is my personal viewpoint. So the genesis of Kiwi Build came from the political party that wasn't in power at the time. And so we had a Conservative party in power for 9 years. The more liberal party developed this idea in the wings. And then when they got voted into power, they said, and bang, here we are. So the housing shortage for us is just massive. That and child poverty, it's got to be like one of the biggest issues New Zealand faces. So they came out with it as their flagship idea. Because like not in front of Parliament, it wasn't fully formed idea. It was a conceptual idea. It was led by a minister who had been coming to our conferences, had been going to community housing conferences, was well aware of innovation, ecosystems, and really interested in change, and bundled up all those good ideas, but probably didn't realize that you can't just tell public servants to execute that. You've got to really create momentum and bring them on a journey. And I think it was literally that sales tactic is where things fell apart, because first of all, you had to sell it to the public servants, you had to sell it to the media, you had to sell it to the public, and you had to sell it to the construction industry. So of course, what happened is anyone involved in innovative construction said, yes, we can do it. And everyone who vaguely done construction said, no way, that's impossible, we can't do it. We have skills shortages, we have all these other problems. So you're crazy, basically. That's my overview.
Yeah, I think also, all this is still within government, so it hasn't been released publicly. It's still, yeah, it's a bit hidden, so the exact causes are uncertain. But one of the issues, I think, is that the government thought they could just say, make this happen to the industry, and that it would happen. But actually the industry was saying, you know, if we need to spend several million to build a factory to be able to roll out all of these houses, we need an ongoing contract. We're not going to do that for 2 or 3 years and then you renegotiate the contract. You know, we need a guaranteed line of work for the next decade. And the government was sort of, I think, saying, we can't give you work for a decade. We could maybe give you 2 or 3 years work, and then we'll throw it out to tender again. And so the company said, we're not going to scale up for that, you know, unless we can really guarantee that. I've just really taken off. It's starting, there's little bits that are starting, but it's a policy that didn't really work. I think not enough integration between industry and government.
And that classic imbalance between perceived innovation and perceived risk. And of course, in New Zealand, we're very good at looking outside ourselves for the answers. So government officials went very quickly to outside of New Zealand to look to import solutions. And that's when PrefabNZ made quite a lot of noise around, hey, we've been doing stuff from the ground up here, dealing with our regulatory system, dealing with the designs that we need for our conditions. So they should be looking closer to home was the messaging we were sending. Yeah.
It's really helpful. I have a follow-up question just after you talked about Kiwi Build, about the regulatory efforts going on, and as much as you might know, it's called the acronym BPMMC, which is quite a mouthful, as you say. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of certifying the factory versus getting a permit and inspecting the project, which I'm assuming is, you know, is similar to how we do it in the US currently, and regulatory barriers are a big challenge for the prefabrication industry in the United States as well. Could you talk a little bit about what's the idea there? What are the drivers? And then
yeah, sure.
The main thing is, why is there reticence to do this, and who is putting up those barriers currently to adopting this method?
So at the moment, New Zealand's got different councils, and each time you apply for a building consent, you go to your local council, and the council inspector comes out and has a look at the building as it's going up, and they mark it off. Therefore, they're liable for if anything goes wrong. So therefore, they're extremely conservative. It's very difficult to be innovative because we've got these sort of nationwide network, but a discontinuous network of very conservative inspectors. So one of the things that the bill is trying to do, so at the moment, if you're prefabricating something, you have to have an inspector come to your site where you're building the building, and then the building goes to site and you have another inspector from another district come and inspect it. So if you're building it outside the district. So that makes the handover and that sort of thing really difficult. So the whole purpose of this bill is to try and get it consented so that it gives the prefabricating, constructing people the ability to self-certify and get the project out there. under their own abilities to QA the project. What that means is that the government officials have put in a whole lot of checks and balances to make sure that somebody isn't just building things in a shed and signing them off and saying, yeah, I've done the QA. So it's very heavy on the QA system, possibly overly heavy, but we tend to do that with our legislation. We tend to go from not enough to quite a lot. And I think there's a question in there somewhere about what are our typical R values and things like in New Zealand that somebody mentioned, and our R values in New Zealand are terrible. So we've got a lot of upskilling of our building code to be done. So the government department is looking at reworking the whole building code and upscaling things, as well as integrating in this ability to build things offsite.
And I think a lot of this to be regular around looking at fabrication and how to permit or consent it is as a result of increased government awareness of prefabrication, which has come about through Kiwi Build, through Minister Twyford, through the work that the Social Housing Agency Kaingaora is doing now. And a lot of that is a result of 10 years of just hard graft advocacy from PrefabNZ and the early adopters in the industry. So in New Zealand, we obviously have much closer connections, 2 degrees of separation. So it's easier to advocate to ministers, especially if they turn up to your conference, have a glass of wine, and you catch them at the right time, right? So this is how, it's a real relationship network here in New Zealand. But I did just see the point where someone said, was it related to opal or mascot? So New Zealand has got this leaky housing issue, but we haven't got the same issue that New South Wales and Australia has got. So some of you will be aware that there was the opal and mascot tower incidences of structural failure. To them, evidence that the construction industry can't deliver Class 2 multi-storey residential buildings successfully. They've put in place a building commissioner. He happens to be a gentleman that used to come to all our collab events, David Chandler, and he's going through a process of putting in structural and regulatory change, but it's not necessarily around offsite construction. It's more around general quality, getting developers, getting architects to lodge as-built drawings and things like that. But you can find out about that through the Building Commissioner Office in New South Wales.
And Pam, when you mentioned type 2, is that your what you call mid-density? What type?
Yeah, the Australians, the Australians say Class 2, meaning it's just high-rise residential, basically, apartment buildings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that seems to be it's a quality issue. One is certifiers not having to come from government; they're independent, and so they can be a developer's mate who signs off the building or signs off various things. So if anyone follows David Chandler on LinkedIn, I think you can read all about what's happening in that space. Yeah.
There's also some questions, and maybe I think we're both also interested in terms of the market penetration, but also the mix of systems in terms of lightwood. I mean, timber being dominant, but lightwood frame, light gauge steel, CLT. So maybe overall, do you have a sense of market penetration, and how do you define that? Because it's difficult. It's often apples and oranges in many other contexts as well. And then is there, you mentioned timber, but what kind of timber systems are more dominant in the offsite space or in the prefab space, and or other types of systems, more or less?
Because nearly all timber grow and hard radiata, then virtually everything we do is out of radiata pine. There's a little bit of Douglas fir and eucalyptus and things, but it's nearly all radiata pine. Grows so fast here. But it also means that it's got really big fat cells because it's growing fast. And that also means that it can suck up water if it gets wet. So, it's really important that our builders and our architects understand the properties of this timber. So it's a very strong, very light timber, which we use everywhere. But we do really need to be very aware that it's got to be detailed properly, or else it leaks. And so the detailing needs to occur whether the building is on-site or off-site. Obviously, when buildings are built completely on-site, then the timber frame as it goes up gets very wet. It's our traditionally totally, which we get this dry timber, we build a building, it gets soaking wet, then we clad it, and then we have to wait for a while for it to dry out again. So there's some obvious things that it may be quicker to build the building in a shed, keep it dry, and then we don't have this wet problem to start with. But we still haven't got that happening on site. It's the very low percentage of buildings that are being fully prefabricated that come onto site. So it's something that both Pam and I have been pushing. Pam's been pushing it for 10 years as the CEO of PrefabNZ, and I've sort of been pushing it by telling my students and things, and then when they go out and get jobs, their bosses tell them, no, that's not possible. So it's a difficult road to hoe, but we're slowly getting there.
But we have got the same kind of consultant or architect-driven love affair with engineered timber or mass timber that we're seeing around the world. So there is a real interest in using engineered timber, laminated veneer lumber, glue laminated, cross laminated. There's a parallel laminate. Oh, what is it that they're doing?
Parallel strand.
PL.
Parallel strand.
Okay, I'm going to get lost in my acronyms, but there's that instead of a cross laminated one, it's a parallel laminated number.
Yep.
Yeah, you get the idea. Anyway, any way you can chip chop wood and glue it back together, we're very interested. We're doing a lot of that. Our timber manufacturing industry has a big legacy in exporting these dumb logs, as there was that great slide that Guy showed. 60% of our trees are cut down and just shipped offshore raw. So it's a really dire situation, and it's only going to last as long as China or Russia or whoever keeps purchasing them. So it's a very short-sighted solution. So that's why the creation of the cross-laminated timber industry in New Zealand has been really interesting in the last years. So used for social housing, multi-story housing, additions on top of buildings, obviously, whenever you've got the need for lightweight. In Australia, of course, we've seen it in the library in the Docklands in Melbourne, and anywhere where there's bad ground conditions. So we're seeing it in all those situations here. Occasionally, the rich farmer who does a folly on his property for the small, single-faceted, beautiful house, but that's, of course, not cost-effective, but looks great. So there's the odd architect-designed use of CLT. But most people and the cross-laminated timber producers themselves will say it's better suited for floor plates, less so for walls, which is why we're seeing hybrid combinations like that Kaingora one, where it's used for floors, and you've got a composite kind of lightweight clad panel for the exterior, and then you're dropping in the bathroom pods. So to me, that's really well, it's a component hybrid panel and pod solution. We're not going to be a volumetric stacking box accommodation solution like Sweden. We simply haven't got that type of scale, maybe at a smaller end, but otherwise we're panel and pod territory. Yeah.
So that's so because even Sweden's primary systems are panelized, they're not CLT and they're not volumetric. Those are the ones that get the attention, but the large percentage of the industry is that's what is open or closed panel lightwood frame. But then in those countries in Northern Europe, there's no site built lightwood frame to compete with to replace that. All lightwood frame construction is basically offsite construction. So, but in the US and Canada and New Zealand and probably Australia, it's sort of uniquely that you're competing against the same system on site and off site, even though they actually are making. Do you have a sense of that, in terms of those panelized systems? Are they making a dent in the, compared to this conventional construction, single digits, double digits?
Totally. And I don't think there's a competition between traditional timber and offsite timber. I mean, the large timber manufacturers who make traditional timber are also doing LVL and CLT. So it's all integrated. It's less competitive. I think what we're all rallying for is the use of more renewable resources and more better value-added onshore manufacturer that we can then export, as opposed to exporting down logs. Yeah.
Cross-laminated timber and starting up a factory, as many of us know on the call, is a significant capital investment. And the one behind Ivan there in the image. I'm wondering how many factories have started up CLT plants, and if you can reveal, what is that story? Is that, as you said, large builders who have taken on CLT? Is that government investment? Is that the lumber industry, the forestry industry? What is that?
Very much the forestry industry. So we did have this company called Xland that started in Nelson, which is at the top of the southern island. And they've since closed down that factory, and the factory's now in Australia. But in the North Island, we've got Red Stag, which is using the forests from the Kangaroo, which is a really big forestry area in the middle of the North Island near Rotorua. And so they've just been building a huge a mass. They're building that factory and getting it running at the moment. So that's going to change things a lot by the end of this year. Also in the South Island, we've got a big LVL factory again in Nelson near the forests there. And there's two or three, three LVL factories, just the one CLT factory at this stage.
Yeah, and we've got some structurally insulated panel, one factory down in the middle of the South Island, and another one that was importing. It's just talking about making locally, which is a great answer. I think what's interesting about the start of the CLT Xland story is really interesting. So a family-owned business brings in the machinery, and they were trying to convince people to start a cross-laminated timber factory. They'd been going to Europe for a number of years and seeing obviously 50 years of CLT in Europe. And so when they realized that people weren't going to invest, they had to, that's how they established at that scale. When they realized they needed to grow, they got more and more input from a large Australian timber company, who eventually saw the need to build a large factory on the border between Victoria and New South Wales, Albury-Wodonga. And so the Xland factory was created. And at that point, they decided to close the New Zealand factory, which had become a smaller outreach kind of R&D. So that's, for us, the sad part of the story. Of course, we're more interested in CLT Trans-Pacific story, and there is, out of Tasmania, of course, is some CLT being produced there from Tasmanian species, is my understanding. And so, yeah, there's a few more CLT plants getting established in Australia. But of course, there's a lot of people importing it, and Lend-Lease, massive developer out of Australia, have been importing all their CLT to date. So there's obviously still a lot of use of imported CLT. New Zealand government has decided that all the timber must be treated, so we cannot import CLT into New Zealand at this stage.
We have done a few projects where we've had to import the CLT from Austria rather than from Australia. We could actually get it cheaper from Austria, which is ridiculous. But they're pumping it out at such volumes over there that we can get CLT cheaply from there.
I see there's always the question maybe about how much does the prefab cost, and so since no one really has a good answer for that because it varies, how do you deal with that from a communications point of view, Pam?
Oh yeah, so we at PrefabNZ, I think it was 2015, we did value case for prefab, and that's a downloadable document. We did a little bit of research with our looked a paper-based exercise of a traditional built house, say 140 square meter single story house, and then one that was made with panels and bathroom pods, and they came up with, I want to say it was 15% more cost effective. But of course we talk in terms of value and what the customer wants. Does the customer want time? Does the customer want a lack of noise so they can do a stage development? Yeah, so you're coming at it with all kinds of different value propositions. But I think the knowledgeable client knows that it's not a cost-saving exercise. It's an exercise in, a mandate to innovate. So a lot of procurement now is insisting on using more innovative methods, and government contracts are insisting on offsite construction for social housing. So we're starting to see responses that are responding more to that mandate in the way it's more time savings.
And just answering Ross's question there about CO2 sequestration, yes, that's coming into law within the next year. So I think the upcoming thing is everyone's going to have to count the amount of carbon in their buildings. So we're working at Victoria University, we're working with one of the big providers here, EBOS, who's talking about materials so that people can have the same uniform way of calculating carbon within each building product. And that's sort of going to be helping drive, I guess, the use of mass timber. Obviously, you know, a CLT wall has got a lot more mass in it than a timber frame wall. And there's a question there about what sort of treatment. And so the treatment really is against fungi, so against mold, as well as against boron and things like that. So we either treat things with boron or with CCA in New Zealand.
Not always. Sometimes we modify.
Yes.
So I'm doing some work for a group called Abodo, ABODO, and they're thermally modified timber solutions. And they've started doing the carbon footprint embedded on their products. And I really love the idea that one day, you know, you'll open your door to welcome your friends in for a glass of wine, and you've got your carbon footprint, you know, right there, kind of embossed in the cladding by your front door, and it'll be your kind of bragging point, you know, oh, look at me, look how amazing I am, the footprint of my house. We're nearly there.
Because of the,
There's also some questions. Oh, sorry,
I'm
Ryan.
just going to follow
Go
up
ahead.
that question about termites. It would stand to reason that given an experience with a ductile material like wood and sort of easy handling, has New Zealand been looking at light gauge steel in any sort of significance, or hot rolled steel for their prefabricated solution?
Yeah. So termites is more of an Australian issue. We don't have to, the termites haven't swum to New Zealand just yet. So, but light gauge steel is 5 to 10% of our residential housing starts. So this is really just a cultural battle that they're trying to fight, which is, you know, in a country surrounded by trees, how do you get another structural material across the line? Obviously, we use structural steel. Our buildings wouldn't stand up. But yeah, light gauge steel framing is doing lots of work around setting their own standards and getting the information out, training builders. You know, they're very much advocacy.
Yeah, to me, because I'm really interested in large scale buildings, one of the interesting things for me is not so much the smaller buildings, but the use of mass timber for really tall buildings. So that's partly what my next book is about on apartment design, but also, you know, looking at it in New Zealand, the way that we've got these seismic issues. And so that building that Pam showed at NMIT, where the whole building sort of goes like this, and it snaps back into position with these post-tension steel wires that go through it. So normally the building just stays there. In a really big quake, it can sort of flop around a bit, and then it goes and it snaps back into the right position. And so we use that on, when I say we, New Zealand has used that on a few buildings around this city and other cities, and it's working really well. The press system, PRESSS, or the press lamb, where it's used with timber. And so those sorts of systems, not obviously needed in countries which don't have the size of the world, and obviously all up the coast of America, down Chile, through Japan, all these sorts of things, then seismic issues are a really big part of it. Because one of the big problems we had in Christchurch is a lot of the buildings fell down, a lot of them stayed up but then had to be demolished afterwards because they were broken at the knees, just down at the bottom. And so the buildings stayed up and they got the people out safely, but then they had to demolish the entire building. And that's just really wasteful. So we're really working hard at this University of Victoria to try and redesign things and work with University of Canterbury is really working hard as well to try and have these systems. And especially if we can do it out of timber, it's actually got a little bit more of a forgiving nature than the concrete buildings, which they have traditionally been building out of.
Yeah, maybe also following up on permitting, and is there any, and sort of relate to seismic, but in general, how much of it there's a framework? We saw proposals in what you showed, but is there a specific framework around prefabricated construction as opposed to conventional construction? How do the two overlap? Are there how does the inspection process in a factory differ from a construction site? Are there inspectors that are sort of educated in this?
So we haven't had a different system to date. So the prefabrication system has had to fit into the traditional system. So the legislation that Guy talked about is the first instance about creating specific legislation to address what we hope is a growing instance of using prefabrication. Hence the consent the factory rather than every single building that comes out. Yeah, so this is the new. So we have been dealing with an ad hoc basis. I mean, there's been a little bit of policy and guidance, but probably much like your interstate scenario where you've got different states and different codes, we also have these different areas or councils or territorial authorities, and they each have slightly different building code. It's left for interpretation because it's a performance-based document, which can make it a very difficult and frustrating time for a prefabrication manufacturer. But it's not impossible. And in New Zealand, a lot of things are relationship-based. So if your factory is in a small town, there's more chance that you can have the local inspector over for morning tea and get them across your project on a kind of daily basis to just check the factory. So there's a little bit of things still happen in that way in our country. But we're trying to become more systematized and process driven. And this all just takes time because the industry has to grow at the same time.
Related to that, it would seem that if there's a movement to certify factories and not necessarily, project by project, that has the potential to encourage a culling and consolidation, a vertical integration of companies that deliver the whole of housing in a way, right? Develop, design, manufacture, install, and wondered, certainly we see that in a place that does have a certification of factory process like Japan, that set that up years ago. And that kind of talk is going on in other parts of the world, including New Zealand. Do you see following in suit like Japan, as you know, Pam, or when we were in Sweden, we saw a large multifamily developer, manufacturer, installer, Lindbacks. Do you see that trend happening in New Zealand as well? Is that being talked about? Because it's certainly happening in the US.
Around vertical integration, or just scale?
Well, I think vertical integration and larger or joint venture, larger sort of vertical alignments or horizontal alignments of delivery.
Yeah, one of the contexts we have in New Zealand is obviously we're a small country. We're about 5 million people. We're churning out, I don't know, 30,000 housing permits a year or something. And our industry is made up 95% of small and medium enterprises, which is 1 to 5 people. So literally the guy, the you, the dog, making one house over 1 year. So it's a big shift for that to change. And the companies that Guy mentioned at the forefront who are able to invest in large-scale manufacture are either literally our largest construction company in the country. Large family entity, traditionally, you're going to be investing more in R&D because you're not having to pay out to shareholders. So those are the kind of two instances that we're seeing. So it's either going to be your family-owned enterprise or your very large corporate. In terms of vertical integration, the company that owns the clever core is, we don't like to use the word monopoly, but maybe a duopoly with another certain company where they own a number of building products, a number of development type entities and construction companies. And of course, as soon as they get into prefabrication, it's either the beginning of prefabrication or the end for everyone else. So we're still watching that space. So there is an element, I guess, of vertical integration in that respect, but it's certainly not that kind of North American example where you've got mortgage and loan. And so we don't have any factory-based housing that is in that affordable trailer or chassis-based. We don't have any of that in New Zealand. And I think it's probably more for our pity, really, because it means we don't have any of that affordable segment, you know. So, of course, we've got our little niche, cute kind of tiny houses and stuff growing, but and we try not to get too mixed up with that, because obviously one person says prefab and another person says tiny. So there's a little bit of all that kind of confusion happening out there. But yeah, in terms of vertical integration, it's really just at that corporate end. Otherwise, it's what government is doing. You know, the role of government is a little bit in that social housing space to kind of integrate housing solutions like they're trying to do. You know, you can part purchase and rent to own. So the government is starting to get into that territory. And that's more of a political move because we now have this more liberal government. So it's not something we've seen before, but they're trying to open up other solutions to housing affordability. But it's so small and it's still trial stage. You know, the big banks are still just doing mortgages on a single house, you know, so we have a very traditional financial arrangement for getting into housing, which needs to change.
And you mentioned ADUs are similar. Is there actual particular stretch code? Is there densification initiatives in, I don't know, some of the larger cities?
Oh, yes.
So that
was an interesting thing that happened just a couple of months ago. To me, it seemed without warning, but suddenly the government said, okay, new policy, anywhere in 500 meters of a rapid transit stop can have buildings not less than 6 stories and up to 10 stories without question, which that really threw the cat amongst the pigeons. Slight problem, we don't actually have any rapid transit, really. So I think they're forward thinking that one day they'll actually get their act into gear and we'll have some rapid transit, and then we might have buildings around that. When I was in Vancouver just last year, and you know, you can really see that whereas the SkyTrain goes along, and then you can see where the next stop is because there's all these buildings which are growing up around it. We haven't got that here yet. We've got a few suburban train lines in 2 cities, and that's it. And we're very, very much reliant on a car-based economy. Everybody has. I think we've got as large or even larger than America in terms of cars per people. Because we're a long, skinny country with not many people, so it means big, long roads. So, yeah, in the weekend, every driving for us to next to another. So it's sort of slightly not everybody, but you know, we've got a lot of car use, and so the idea that we're going to transition very, very rapidly to something which is full of rapid transit trains or trams zipping up and down through our streets. It's something that a lot of us want to see, but at the moment it's looking pretty unlikely that it's going to happen.
We have had one regulatory change recently, which is if you want to build without a building permit, you can do it if it's less than 10 square meters. So you could always build a little box in your backyard full of air for 10 square meters, right? And of course, people sell these things, you know, rent a room, etc., buy a cabin, just cabins, whatever. So people sometimes do this when they need a spare room. When we were doing the snug competition, we went to local and hey, in the Netherlands, you can build 30 square meters without needing a building permit. This is much more realistic. You can live in 30 square meters, right? And especially if you go up. So they did not want the idea about giving open fettered access to 30 square meters without building consent. So we said, we'll do a design competition. We'll bring 12 pre-approved ideas, blah, blah, blah. And we went down that track and then invited the mayor back for that prize giving. So it was kind of left at that. And then some successful winners went on to create their own companies and send their homes out to market. But interestingly, a few months ago, the government just without any warning just said, hey, it's going to be 30 square meters before you need building consent. And we all went, what? Where did that come from? So either they were digesting slowly in the back of their minds, or there was someone else lobbying to them, but that has been a little change. Of course, bus or attached to infrastructure, you need to get a building consent. If, depending where it's positioned on your property, you need to get a planning or what we call a resource consent. So there's still paperwork to go through, but in theory, that has opened up people's backyards to be able to create their own accessory dwelling units at that scale of 30 square meters. And also, I believe, still need to use a licensed building practitioner for all building work, even if it's not going through the permit process.
Yeah, I like being able to build things myself. Much more fun. And so sometimes you need to break the rules. I'm not sure if I should have said that out loud, but you know, got to push those boundaries.
That was something we that came in probably 10 years ago, the licensed building practitioner scheme. So you have to have an LBP either in your factory or on site.
More acronyms. They love those acronyms. It is up to that makes sense to nobody really. But
that was to try and get rid of cowboy builders. It didn't particularly work, but you know.
Yeah.
That's it.
You know, here
Cool.
here at the end of the webinar, we just ask the question, perhaps the last question, which is, what do you see as the future of prefabrication in New Zealand? Lots of different directions are going on around the world. What do you see as the future? What does the business models look like? What do the products and components look like? Do you see it following the same path, or do you think it's going to take a different route? Say in the next, let's give you a time frame, 30 years. What are we going to see in New Zealand?
Maybe 10.
Well, New Zealand, as I said, you know, we love this idea of being the cowboy out on the open range, but you know, with a hammer and a nail gun and your dog in the ute building the house, and that's going to take a lot of getting over because builders have spoken. They take those pictures, you guys, of a factory, and they're like, I don't want to work in a factory. You know, that's to them, that's just the end of the story. They'd rather leave the profession and do something else than work in a factory. So we've got a real problem there with the actual people doing the work. But I think that you know, hopefully, if this bill does free up some of the regulatory problems, then we are going to see a lot more prefab. But it's going to be growing from a very small base. And by 30 years' time, will we have 50% of the market? I doubt it.
I don't know about a measure, but I can just imagine the landscape. By 2050, our landscape is going to be much more medium density housing. We're going to have a lot more of these government social housing delivered, for example, 3-story walk-ups and other prototypes of that scale, because now that it's seeded in government and in those agencies, it is happening. It's just slow, but it is happening. And it's a lot of so within the next 30 years, we will see a lot more social housing delivered this way, and we will see a lot more added value timber. I mean, this is the New Zealand story. And I hope that we will see that added value timber story extend out, either through technology interface and change and collaboration. I mean, there's other nodes of timber out there. Scotland's got great stuff happening. Pacific West Coast has got great things happening. You know, we should be all a lot more connected and helping get all this great technology out further afield. So I'm sure we'll see a lot more innovation around timber buildings. And I hope that's into our public buildings, you know, our hospitals, our schools, our, you know, cornerstone infrastructure needs to be exhibiting these timber technologies. So that takes some strong advocates inside government and inside the procurement agencies. So let's hope we see a bit more of that. And of course, this is going to be driven not through innovation, but through carbon. That's what we'll be seeing, is it'll be all about reducing our carbon footprint by enabling more timber construction.
With that, I want to thank Pamela Bell and Guy Marriage for joining us on this webinar. Thank you to all the attendees who asked questions and participated. Again, we will post this to YouTube and our MODEX website, and continue to follow the great things from modex.network. We have a number of events coming up and look forward to you participating. Thanks again, Pam and Guy, MODEX New Zealand.
Thanks.
Thank you,
everybody.